So I was out of town this past weekend, which unfortunately has delayed my going over the latest court documents in Blake Lively's case against Wayfarer Studios. And while I'm working on doing that, I found something else that came up that caught my attention that I want to talk about really quickly today. And that's this YouTube video from today, which has clips of a new interview with Ryan Reynolds. And he doesn't say much about the lawsuit, but what he does say about the lawsuit is interesting because it shows there has not really been very much reflection by him or his wife, Blake Lively, about what they have done and what behaviors they have contributed that may have caused some of the negative public attention they received and some of the public backlash they got. Now that the federal judge threw out Blake Lively's sexual harassment claims and defamation claim, the remaining case is strictly about contract violation and these allegations of retaliation. She claims that she received public backlash and reputational damage because of the Wayfarer parties and their crisis PR strategy. And there's a real lack of awareness or lack of care for her own actions and behavior that actually led to that backlash. So the things that people are complaining about or saying negative things about, she doesn't acknowledge those things. She simply says that it's Justin Baldoni and the Wayfarer party's fault that she was getting that backlash. Blake and Ryan seem to think that there's not a problem because people shouldn't have been exposed to Blake's behavior on such a wide scale. So the things that were upsetting people, they shouldn't have been given so much attention. And it's Wayfarer Studios' fault, according to them, that it was given attention. And they're so focused on that they never really offer an apology or an explanation for anything. Or I honestly think they could have just given a big fat F you to a lot of their critics and they would have been fine. Some of that stuff, especially the older stuff that was coming up from years and years ago, she could have just said, listen, I was having a bad day. Yeah, I didn't react great, or I didn't maybe act the way that I should have acted in that situation, but I've moved on and I'm not going to continue to dwell on this part of my life. I think that would have been okay. I think that would have been an acceptable reaction, to be honest. And I think there would have been a lot of people who would have stood by her for that. But instead, her reaction was to blame other people, pretend that she never did anything wrong in the way that people were complaining about, and basically blame Justin Baldoni for other people's reactions to her behavior and her statements that are recorded on video or in written interviews. And it's sort of like denying something that people can very clearly see is real. If she had honestly said nothing and just let it die down, I really think it wouldn't have affected her long term either. But the one thing you can do that's for sure going to get you a lot more criticism is to try to convince everybody who has a negative opinion of you that they only have a negative opinion of you because they're stupid. And that's basically what she's done throughout this entire case and with her New York Times article. She wants people to believe that all of the criticism she received was because of bots or some crisis PR strategy. She wants people to believe that she was defamed somehow, even though the things that people are criticizing her for are either reasonable matters of opinion or true things. And she wants people to believe that she is an icon for women who have been abused or violated somehow, all while never addressing the behavior that upset her audience in the first place. Her whole strategy has basically been to deflect or distract or to pretend her critics aren't real. And I don't think that's going to play well in front of a jury because these people in Hollywood all have these PR cannons that they aim at each other, or they boost and suppress certain information about themselves or other people in Hollywood. So this very same system for the elite that Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds have used to get ahead in their careers is something they now want to complain about and thrust themselves into some sort of iconic sainthood over, all while pretending that their critics are all brainless or terrible people. They can't simply be regular everyday people who see what they're doing or have listened to their interviews or things that they've said or done and just don't like them. Rather than address the issues at hand, they've seemed to try to bully people into liking them, and it's just not working. So let me play this short clip from the interview about the lawsuit and about Blake, and then we'll talk about why I think this is so silly.
Legal proceeding. How have you guys managed that as a family?
You really see kind of the illusion behind so much of this stuff, digital life versus real life. Really, without getting into it too much, I'll just say I've never in my life been more proud of my life.
No, I fully expect for Ryan as her husband to support Blake here. I'm not surprised by that at all. But this whole thing about the illusion he's alluding to and this real life versus digital life stuff that he's alluding to, that's where I think he's really missing the mark. And we're going to look at his own text messages to kind of talk about that in a second.
People have no idea what's really going on, and I've just never in my life been more proud of someone with that level of integrity that brings that with them and carries that with them in everything that they do.
And just to comment really quickly on the second part of that clip where he talks about her carrying herself with integrity and everything that she does, my mind goes back to this Van Zandt lawsuit where she intentionally abused court process using one of their companies to sue John Doe's 1 through 10, pretending that she didn't know whose text messages she was trying to obtain. She then used that lawsuit to write a subpoena to JonesWorks to get the messages between Justin Baldoni and his publicists and others, even though she had already obtained those text messages improperly by violating a woman's privacy, because Jennifer Abel certainly did not give Blake Lively permission to have all the contents of her phone. So in order to make it look like she obtained those messages through a lawsuit, she used a company that had nothing to do with Justin Baldoni, Jennifer Abel, or anyone else to file a fake lawsuit for breach of contract against John Doe's 1 through 10, and how can you have a breach of contract lawsuit against people you don't know? You can't, because you haven't entered into a contract with them. Sent the subpoena over to Stephanie Jones, who felt scorned by Justin Baldoni and Jen Abel, and who then just turned over to Blake Lively whatever she wanted without ever challenging it and without ever notifying Jennifer Abel that they were going to violate her privacy in that way, never giving Jennifer Abel a chance to fight that subpoena. And if you have a problem understanding why that shows such a lack of integrity, really think about that and take Blake Lively out of the equation. Say you are one of the John Doe's 1 through 10 and somebody who really doesn't like you, maybe someone who abused you in the past, maybe a politician you've criticized online who wants to punish you for it, is now trying to obtain your private information and uses a fake lawsuit to do so, intentionally not naming you in that lawsuit so that you don't have a chance to use your legal rights to fight any subpoena for your information, and then closes that lawsuit after getting your information without any judge ever being assigned to the case and never giving you any opportunity for recourse before they blasted all of that information that they obtained all over the internet through the New York Times. And that would give that abuser or that person in power access to every conversation you've ever had about them with a friend, to every strategy you've ever come up with to combat the kind of abusive tactics they're using against you. And you would be none the wiser until it was too late and your life was already ruined. Now, does the person who abused the courts in that situation seem to have a lot of integrity in what they're doing? I would say no. But let's go back to this illusion that Ryan is talking about. This people have no idea what they're talking about, the difference between, real life and online life and all that. To an extent, that's true. I think people should separate their in-person interactions and their real life, so to speak, from their online life. But when you're a celebrity or a popular figure in like TV and movies and you depend on the public for your livelihood, you do have to be kind of dialed into the opinions of people online. How much attention you want to pay to that is really up to you. You could just hire publicists or other people to handle your social media, which I think a lot of celebrities do. And that way you can just kind of move on with your life and you get to choose when you want to look at social media. You don't have to respond to comments that might be unpleasant or negative or even harassing. But there comes a problem when you try to deny the reality of the public or the critics and the things that they're criticizing, or act like they're stupid and the only reason they possibly couldn't like you is because they don't know better, that they can't think for themselves, that they can't make up their own minds. And Ryan Reynolds seems to have a fundamental inability to accept that he has genuine critics, and that his wife has genuine critics over the things she's done in this lawsuit, the way she's abused court process, the people she's attacked over exaggerated claims, the self-righteousness and the self-appointment of herself as an icon for women's suffering or women's issues, as some kind of pioneer for women's rights, after she sat around and did and said nothing while countless women were abused on the casting couch, and their agency WME refused to denounce Diddy after beating the shit out of Cassie on camera. So the way that Ryan and Blake respond to these critics is why this keeps snowballing and snowballing and snowballing. And it's not even that they're just trying to convince all of their critics that they must be stupid for not liking them, or convince everyone else on the internet that the people who are criticizing them are just like silly little girls who can't make up their mind. It's the fact that Blake Lively has now multiple times throughout the course of this lawsuit tried to portray herself as some sort of god queen of women's rights issues without doing any real work other than suing someone to try to obtain millions of dollars. That makes people question her motives for the lawsuit and the things that she's saying. Anyone can really decide that they want to start putting in the work to make the world or a film set or whatever a better place. But you don't start by going on talk shows and appointing yourself as some sort of self-declared icon for those issues. That's not how that works. And these texts between Ryan and Colleen Hoover, the author of the book that the film It Ends With Us was based on, do a pretty good job of demonstrating how out of touch they are with the actual issue here. Colleen says, "I had a feeling this was Justin's team controlling the online narrative." And the problem with that is there are actual quotes, actual video clips going around that people are criticizing. And they just write it off as, oh, Justin's controlling the narrative. But even if Justin's crisis team were the sole reason people were seeing these clips and quotes, they don't control people's reaction to it. So the correct response to that criticism could have been nothing at all. Like I said, I think they could have just let it blow over and everything would have been fine. Or they could have really looked into some of that criticism and what people were saying and thought about what can we do to kind of shift the conversation here. But the correct response to that was absolutely not to try to convince everyone that they're stupid for having a human reaction to the things that they're seeing that Blake said and did, or Colleen said and did, or genuine criticisms of the marketing, which was largely, controlled by Ryan Reynolds' company Maximum Effort and Blake Lively, who had control over everything, as she herself admitted in her PGA letter. Ryan says here, "It's amazing to me that you can have everybody involved with the production completely run away from a person who is obviously a predator and sociopath, and the narrative must first land on why a woman is the problem." So all of these alleged problems on set, people don't really know too much about that. The criticism that they were getting at this point was actually about the things that Blake was saying and doing. So yes, the woman Blake would be the problem in that one. And you can see here that Colleen Hoover says, "I feel like the loud ones are mostly 13-year-olds who don't have fully developed brains yet and will be mortified by their thought process a few years from now." So even though grown women, a lot of grown women are using their real names and faces online to talk about their, issues or how they felt negatively about certain things that were going on in the marketing of this film, or even the way the book was written, Colleen Hoover writes them off as 13-year-olds with underdeveloped brains. They couldn't possibly have real critics. Even the ones that are showing themselves. They couldn't be real. They're just bots. Ryan says, "Surprising, it's mostly girls. At least that's what I've seen. And the really smart folks already know." Because Ryan is shocked that women have the agency to make up their own minds about things and voice their opinions, and that they can, in fact, make a judgment on somebody based on their character and actions instead of their gender. The reason Ryan, Blake, and Colleen think that this is an illusion or fake is that they're surrounding themselves with yes men who need to give them what they want and tell them what they want to hear in order to keep profiting off them. They need them for social climbing and for money. So nobody's going to have the balls to actually tell them that they should consider the criticism that they're getting, the substance of it, and maybe do something about that. Saying that they don't think they deserve the backlash because they don't think people should be paying attention to these bad things, that's one way to walk through it. So they're completely denying the existence and the actual feelings of critics, going out into the press or into a lawsuit and saying, no, these people are just dumb and this man did a smear campaign and people just don't know what they're talking about. When the people who don't know what they're talking about are actually responding to things they can see with their own eyes and hear with their own ears, that's not gonna go well. And that's not an illusion, that's just denial. And nobody can force them to, accept that criticism. Nobody can force them to pay attention to it or even do anything about it, really. Like I said, they could have just moved on with their lives and been fine. But instead of letting people have their opinions and leaving them alone, they decided to try to convince everybody that the people who were talking negatively about them were just little dummies, little girls with underdeveloped brains. Blake and Ryan and Colleen Hoover think these people are beneath them, and they would like everyone to know it. And here's an extremely, extremely long message from Ryan Reynolds to people at WME. And in this message, Ryan's talking about the 26 things on the list of demands that Blake and Ryan presented them after phase 1 of filming and before phase 2, and basically said that even one of the things on that 17-point list would be considered irretrievably monstrous and shocking. He also says that Blake should not be subjected to some eye-rolling narrative of the controlling bitch. And the problem with that is that people are allowed to form their own opinions on public events and public proceedings, especially when it comes to public figures. Now, I would agree to the extent that people shouldn't be harassing Blake and forcing themselves on her and forcing her to listen to them talk like this to her. But as far as people posting on their own social media platforms saying they think she's controlling or a bitch, they're allowed to have those opinions and they're allowed to express themselves as they see fit. Should she choose to seek that out and upset herself by reading negative things about her online, well, that's not ideal, but you can't stop other people from exercising their rights to free speech and free expression just because a public figure only wants positive attention. I strongly disagree with people tagging her in things and trying to get her attention so that they can say strictly negative things to her or annoy her on purpose. I think it's one thing to express yourself. It's another thing to like literally attack someone. I don't agree with sending her threatening or vulgar DMs. I don't agree with pranking her in real life. I think that's crazy. But Blake Lively is the type of person who blasted her story in the New York Times and on Instagram has literally said, don't write this off as celebrity drama. It's supposed to keep you from seeing yourself in my story. Like, she wants people to see themselves in her story. And when people see things that they don't like, they're allowed to express that. Especially if you're asking people to pay attention to your story and to have an opinion. You don't get to then control what that opinion is or how they choose to express it, as long as they aren't attacking and harassing you. And no, using your own social media page to say words about somebody that they don't like, that's not harassment. Unless somebody's threatening to do something to hurt somebody, then that would be a problem. Or if you're directing other people to harass them, then that would be a problem. And then back up to the first thing I highlighted there with the 26 things on the list, which is actually 17 things on the list. People who have actually been through sexual harassment in the workplace or through sexual abuse or domestic violence relationships and don't like the way that she has handled herself. Now that they've seen the context of those 17 things she put in the list and how some of it is highly questionable or was intentionally misleading, a lot of people are not going to agree with that. For example, she and her attorneys like to say that Justin randomly described his genitalia to her. But actually, while in Blake Lively's home, surrounded by other people and with Ryan Reynolds around, Blake Lively brought up the topic of circumcision, and Justin Baldoni mentioned that his parents had had him circumcised. And it's not a sexy thing. That is not a sexual conversation. That is a medical procedure, sometimes a religious practice. Now, is that something that I would necessarily want to hear from a male friend? Not really. And they weren't working together at the time. Like, she was not his employee. She never was his employee, but she was definitely not his employee then. They weren't even filming, and she hadn't even signed on to do the movie. But when somebody says something like that and you think, man, I didn't like that, that's really like not the kind of thing that I want to hear. I don't want to get that personal. All you have to do is say that. You can nip that in the bud. Because there's nothing inherently like sexually harassing or gross about talking about circumcision, especially when Blake Lively was the one to bring it up. But it doesn't mean that she has to talk about it if she doesn't want to. You just have to communicate and express that. But then don't write it up in a list and use it to threaten them later on and intentionally misrepresent the context when blasting this out to the public. Because when the public then finds out that it was a conversation that you brought up and that you guys were talking about circumcision, he didn't just randomly describe his genitalia to you, they're going to have a hard time believing some of the other things you say. So there are very valid reasons that they're receiving the kind of criticisms that they've received, because they're not always totally honest about the context of these situations. And yet they really believe that everyone else in the world is doing the worst things imaginable to them. And here's another long text to people at WME. He says, we all work with people who aren't necessarily good at their job, but usually they're nice people. So we shrug and move on. But when they're incompetent predators and frauds, that hits different. My wife wasn't going to finish this film as both a victim and a proud recipient of a shitty movie and a shitty opening. The only headline would be Blake Lively bombs. He doesn't get to walk away like that. The thing that I believe both my wife and I are missing most in this debacle is your rage. And he's talking to WME. And I hope I've illustrated why that is. I have never had anything but an intense love and admiration for WME and the entire company, but I've also never needed WME like I do in this moment. I am always comfortable handling my own shit, but this situation, this is a situation in which I need, along with Blake, a sense of solidarity and duty of care. And again, Ryan and Blake want us to believe they're like pioneers for women's rights and safety, though I guess they've now abandoned the narrative of abuse in favor of being digital violence poster people instead. But they're acting like these men, Justin and Jamie, did some of the most horrible, atrocious things that have ever been heard of. But the public has seen that things did not exactly occur as Blake Lively said they did. And there's footage to prove that. And when people give their opinions based on what they've witnessed with their own eyes and ears, Blake and Ryan just write it off as digital violence, because criticizing someone for perceived lying about an occurrence of sexual harassment is violence now, I guess. And he's here blowing smoke up the asses of WME, who don't give a single shit about their own clients abusing women, as long as the client is a moneymaker. Nothing else matters. So Ryan, the moneymaker, was able to get WME to drop Justin as a client. And he's here totally destroying the reputation of the Wayfarer parties. And you can tell this is not the first time he's ever had a conversation like this. And then he's upset when they defend themselves in the press or with crisis PR. You don't get to attack someone like this to their agency, get them fired or dropped as a client, and then ruin their life, and then expect them to do nothing about it. Here, Ryan's trying to suggest that Justin and Jamie and Wayfarer should put out some sort of statement apologizing for everything because Blake was in the shit with her marketing. But the thing is, Blake had all the power. She had all the power to take over the film, to do everything that she said she did in her PGA letter, to get her cut of the film used. But we're supposed to believe that someone else is at fault for her bad marketing? She had all that power and control and influence to do everything that she wanted, except talk about domestic violence in the marketing. Why are we trying to blame someone else for this? She absolutely could have pivoted her marketing strategy if she wanted to. She was terrorizing these people behind the scenes into doing everything she wanted, and we've seen that through the messages from Sony executives. And Ryan had his company Maximum Effort handling the marketing. There's nothing that you could say at this point that can convince me that they couldn't have at least tried a little harder to change the way they were marketing this film and that it wouldn't have had a different outcome. It at least would have quieted down some of the criticism. And if they were noticing that people had a problem with this and they decided not to do anything about it, then they should be the ones to put out a statement apologizing. They could have even made a joint statement, but they're asking the studio to take full responsibility for Blake's bad decisions. And again, some of the stuff they were complaining about Justin doing was absolutely insane. So Ryan here is complaining about how Justin's first cut of the film included simulated penetration of a 15-year-old girl. So there was a sex scene between teenage characters in the movie. This is not a novel idea, but the actors playing those characters were full-blown adults. And so they're trying to paint him as some sort of perverted predator who likes inappropriate sexual content with minors. And that's absolutely not the case, but you can see what they're trying to do with that. And that's a pretty wild thing for him and his wife to complain about. We know these people are not minors. They're full-blown adults in their 20s. They're actors. Stop trying to pretend there was anything inappropriate happening with children unless you're trying to say all film and television, which shows actors portraying teenagers having any sort of relations is a problem. If that is the case, I would like to know when Blake and Ryan are going to rally against the people who brought you Gossip Girl. If that's the position they want to take, it needs to be consistent. This isn't some sort of Weinstein casting couch situation, but Blake and Ryan really don't want to talk about Weinstein. They're fine with Weinstein. They're fine with Diddy beating the shit out of Cassie and still being supported by WME. They're fine with the teenage sex scenes in Gossip Girl. So this is all weird selective outrage that they're intentionally blowing out of proportion and trying to use to ruin Justin's reputation. They're not getting bad criticism or backlash because of some special internet illusion. They're getting backlash because they refuse to acknowledge their own behavior and act like they're the most special and superior people in the world. They write off critics as teens with underdeveloped brains or bots, and even when the critics are the adults using their real faces and names and reacting to things that Blake and Ryan have really said or done that can be demonstrated and viewed over and over again. And they're just trying to deny that that's a reality. And again, Blake is asking people to see themselves in her story, to not write off her story as celebrity drama. And then she can't handle it when people react to that in a way that she doesn't like. Or when people do see themselves in her story, a lot of them see her as the bully who tormented them with some of the same manipulative tactics and popularity contests. And it doesn't help when she tries to make everything about her. I saw her Instagram post about Justin Bieber's Coachella set, which has nothing to do with her, but she's trying to make it about her type of internet drama. And if she wants to make this about Justin Bieber, then why doesn't she pull some of that advocacy she keeps pretending to actually engage in and use it to speak out against WME and the people who have abused and wronged child stars or women in the industry? Where was all that outrage for Cassie when WME did nothing to condemn Diddy? What about all those women who were abused on the casting couch? Blake and Ryan want to be so outspoken about this when it comes to Justin Baldoni in a situation where there's no actual evidence of any abuse occurring, but they don't say a damn word about situations involving actual abuse. Why? Because they're just cosplaying as people who actually care about these issues. They don't actually care about issues of domestic violence or sexism or abuse. Blake and Ryan using weird sexual innuendo in all of their conversations with Justin Baldoni, but then being outraged when he calls an outfit sexy, but they don't say anything about a situation involving actual abuse. The actual important issue to these people here, to me, seems very clearly to be social status and profit. And the fact that they keep adamantly pretending otherwise is just getting them more and more criticism that they refuse to believe is genuine. But I think they really do believe a lot of this might be an illusion. I mean, they're surrounded by yes men whose job it is to keep the cash flow. They're out of touch with legitimate critics because they can't accept that there's anything they may have done wrong or could have done differently. And when they are faced with real people offering real criticism, They write them off as stupid children who are beneath them and simply don't know what they're talking about. And that is one way to make sure you keep pissing off the public and tarnishing your own reputation. But they certainly seem interested in sticking to this story, so I guess we'll have to wait and see how it plays out in court. That's all I got for now, guys. I'll be back later on, probably tomorrow, to go over some of those documents I didn't get to last week. Thanks for watching. I am going to put a link to my trial fundraiser in the comments down below. I'll pin it at the top. I plan on going out to New York to be there and to report back on what happened. So if you want to help me out with that, that's great. I appreciate everyone who's taken the time to help out. But for now, don't forget to hit the like button for me because it helps me out a lot. And I'll see you all soon. Thanks.